Hello everyone, my name is Jay Shah and today I'll be doing the editorial analysis of the 27th of November. This has been in my mind for a pretty long time and I hope that the fruits of my forbearance are rewarded. And do let me know at the end of this analysis of what you think about it or how can it be made more interesting, right? So we'll primarily focus on the Hindu newspaper and the editorials which are written on page 8 and page 9 of the Delhi edition. Right. So the first article which we are going to focus is the National Family Health Survey, or also known as the NFHS, the fifth edition of which was recently launched last week. So what is the National Family Health Survey? So the NFHS is basically a report card of the health and demographic indicators of India as a whole, of where it stands in terms of major policy decisions which have been taken by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So the last NFHS survey was taken way back in 2015-16, and after a hiatus of 5 years, it has been for the year 2020 and 2021. So it was conducted in two phases, and the results of both have been released. So there have been some positive changes and some not very good results which have come out of the survey. So we'll focus on them. The first is with respect to population. Now the total fertility rate of India has dropped below the replacement level of 2.1. That means that for the Indian population to grow, it needed to grow at 2.1 total fertility rate. Now, what does total fertility rate mean? Total fertility rate means the number of progeny which a woman can produce during her reproductive years or during her lifetime. So it has dropped below 2.1. That means the population has relatively stabilized. So that is a good thing. That shows that the family planning programs which were initiated and followed with rigor, because in case of many elections to maybe local elections, panchayat elections, seats used to be denied to those candidates who would have more than two children. So such policies were brought out to encourage the well-known, the well-prophesized concept of hum do, hamare do, and gradually we have been partly successful in it, as the NFHS survey shows. So the continuation of such incentives related to the number of children, is it justified or not? There's a question mark over it, and the editorial says that there's no justification regarding the same because it has fallen well below the replacement level of 2.1. As regards sex ratio, again there is uh, a positive outcome which has come. The adult sex ratio is 1020 females is to 1000 males. So for the first time, the number of females have outnumbered males, but this ratio overlooks the regional disparities which exist in various states. This is a national figure, but region to region or state to state, this may differ. A more accurate indicator would be sex ratio at birth, also known as SRB. So it shows 100 female births as compared to 105 male births. So why is there discrepancy between the adult sex ratio and sex ratio at birth? Because the adult sex ratio not only takes into account female feticides or targeted female feticides in preference for male progeny, but it also takes into account various factors, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been large-scale migration of males in terms of work, or there might be some sampling errors because of arising out of it. As a result, adult sex ratio is more comprehensive, it is more broad based compared to the sex ratio at birth, which gives a more accurate indicator of the effectiveness of the PCPNDT Act, which prohibited sex determination in order to prevent female feticide. So this was as regards sex ratio, so far so good. However, in the third indicator, which is anemia, the results have been dismal. Despite the popularity of the Anemia Mukt Bharat program or Anemia Mukt Bharat Abhiyan, anemia across all categories with respect to age and across all states has risen. WHO states that 20 to 40% of population, if anemic, is considered to be moderate anemia. But in India, it has crossed more than 40%, even 55% and 60% in females, in males and females as well. that points towards a grim picture. So, except the state of Kerala, all the states have been in a severe category of anemia, and that needs a policy revision. As regards nutrition, again, there's good news, there's bad news. The three major indicators, which is stunting, underweight, and wasting. So, stunting refers to a chronic nutritional deficiency, which is height for age, because height is a long term factor. Underweight, which is weight for age, because weight is affected by acute changes in nutrition and health and diseases. And wasting, which is again a chronic indicator of nutrition, which is weight for height. So all three indicators have shown improvement, so that's good news. But obesity is on the rise, and that should not come as a surprise because of the fad of Western diets and the arrival of new and new franchises of Western fast food companies. So obesity is also a form of malnutrition. Overnutrition and undernutrition both come under malnutrition. So obesity as a form of malnutrition increases the risk for non-communicable diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, cancers, and there's no doubt that these diseases are increasing. So there's a gradual shift from nutritional based disorders or undernutrition disorders, infectious disorders towards disorders which are non-communicable and come with a lifestyle which is not suited with the Indian environment. One limitation of the NFHS survey has been it does not provide any data with respect to micronutrients, especially micronutrients such as zinc or micronutrients such as iodine, because we know for a matter of fact that iodine deficiency contributes to hypothyroidism and especially in females. So iodine deficiency is the main cause. The NFHS survey does not shed light on micronutrients. In the subsequent surveys, maybe it would be included. So what do we make out of it? So there's cautious optimism. Why cautious optimism? But because despite a minimal spending of 1 to 1.5% GDP, which is dismal in the health sector, especially in the public health sector, overall, it shows that the strategies which have been there have been effective. This shows that at the grassroots level, there has been proper policy implementation, except for anemia, of course. So COVID-19, however, has exacerbated the deteriorating public health, which was again brought out in the report as the health infrastructure crumbled. And with respect to hospital deliveries, it was shown that there was a huge disparity between C-section rates in private hospitals and government hospitals, 50% and 14 to 15%. This again points towards broader questions of a woman's right over her health and body versus the broad term monetary gains of corporate hospitals. There needs to be a proper or a diligent uh, investigation into the wide scale disparity which is being observed in the C section rates. Again, health disparity has been very visible during the pandemic, and the authors say that we need to apply a three-pronged approach. First is a clear roadmap, which would outline the broad contours and the end objectives. Second is a political commitment to it, irrespective of the government in power. And third is allocation of adequate material and economic resources to achieve the same. So the trinity of all these three will ensure that India stays on the path of combating its health challenges. So we have a fair amount of success in tackling the social problems of population explosion and female feticide. However, we need to now focus our attention on the emerging health challenges with respect to pandemics and non-communicable diseases. Right. So the next editorial focuses on remembering Verghese Kurian because 26th of November 2021 happened to be his 100th birth anniversary. So Verghese Kurian, fondly known as the milkman of India or the father of white revolution, because it is under his watch and under his leadership that India became the world's largest producer of milk in the world. So the editorial focuses on his model of business or model of governance, which was the cooperative model, because he strongly believed that the public sector or the government sector suffered from bureaucratic inertia or had a colonial mindset of inertia of not being amenable to change, whereas the corporate sector focused on maximizing profits at all bases. And it was this divide which was very concerning. So, according to August Kurian, his famous quote was India's time in the sun would be when there is a cooperation between rural wisdom and urban professionalism. And that's what he set out on achieving. Because, make no mistake, Verghese Kurian had practically no experience in the farming sector. He was a metallurgical engineer by profession, hailing from Kerala, and he was able to convince the farmers of the cooperative model in Gujarat, bringing them together and forming the largest milk union, which is Anand Milk Union Limited, fondly known as Amul. He was also inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, which said that development does not mean mass production, it means production by the masses at the grassroots level for social elevation and for removing economic disparity. Right. So how did Amul become the brand which we know today? He brought the positive factors of corporate governance, which were proper management, smart marketing tactics, branding, and efficient production. So marketing, management, production, these were the three bases on the basis of which he scaled Amul, right? Similar cooperatives have been encouraged, especially Nandini in Karnataka is a very big cooperative, and Verka in Punjab. The author argues that why is it that the agricultural sector has not stepped up and why has it been left behind the bogey of industrialization or production at large by the masses? One of the primary reasons has been a lack of leadership which resonates. Because if we consider the farm laws, which we'll be talking about in the subsequent slides, there has been no charismatic leader which could, bring different factions together for a consultative process, which would have the participation of all. So agricultural sector as a whole has been labor intensive because the statistics say that close to 66% or 60% of population is engaged in agriculture, while it provides only 15 to 10 to 15% of the gross domestic product, so which is grossly dysenergetic or inappropriate compared to the inputs which we provide. So, what would be the way forward? So, for the agricultural sector, the writer argues that similar principles can be applied, which would be diversifying incomes or diversifying the produce. So, from a single produce, multiple things can be made to invest in warehouses for storage to reduce wastage, increasing per hectare yields, and sustainable water use. Because anything which might be profitable in the near term needs to be sustainable in the long term, right? So this was about Verghese Kurian. Our next two editorials are small ones and they focus on the Manrega scheme and the proposed changes in the GST taxation regime. So Manrega stands for Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So it ensures 100 days of paid work, 100 days of paid work to members of family in rural areas. So it was started by the UPA regime. It was ridiculed by the current dispensation when it was in the opposition, but it has found that in terms of economic distress which was faced during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Manrega scheme proved to be a lifeline for the poor. However, recent changes or recent values suggest that there has been a budgetary shortfall of up to 20%, as a result of which states are not able to reimburse the employees or the workers who have been working in these projects. And as a result, new work is also being limited. So, the writer argues that to prevent an economic distress of unemployment, which is running currently very high in rural areas because of lack of adequate employment opportunities, the center needs to clear the existing dues and provide allocation as per the revised estimates and not in a manner which would be just incremental or an ad hoc basis. It needs to be done keeping in line with the revised estimates so that the shortfall will be prevented. As regards GST or the goods and services tax, which was brought into effect in 2017, the writer argues that it was brought to simplify taxation regime, but frequent changes in tax slabs and the commodities which come under each tax slab has made it more complicated. So the GST Council, which comprises of both the center and the state, has empowered a group of ministers to reconsider the tax slabs. So currently we have 0, 6, 12, 18, and 28. So 0 on essential goods, 28 on sin goods or merit goods. And now they propose only 3 slab system of 8, 15, and 30%. So again, rather than changes on either side of the spectrum, keeping uh, electoral politics in mind or pleasing some particular community or community of traders in lieu of elections, for long-term sustenance, it is important that there should be less variability and more predictability in terms of the taxation regime. So this is what the authors argue. And our final topic for a pre-final topic would be the repeal of the three farm laws. Now, as we would all know, on the occasion of Guru Nanak Jayanti, Prime Minister Narendra Modi on national television apologized for the three farm laws and assured the countrymen that they would be repealed. Now, the entire farm law saga, from the enactment to the repeal, outlines the fault lines which are there in national policy making, especially concerning agriculture. Because originally they were promulgated as ordinances, then they were bulldozed through the parliament without any source for consultation. There was no negotiation, no deliberation. The farmers came out on the streets. The government underestimated them. The stalemate lasted for a year. In between, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, when the ground feedback suggests that the tide is not in favor of the ruling dispensation or the majoritarian dispensation, uh, in view of the upcoming assembly elections for Uttar Pradesh and Punjab, and also bringing up the bogey of communal considerations, saying that this has created a wedge between Hindus and Punjab, and BJP does not want it to be divided, which is quite contrary to the policies which it is advocating. These farm laws have been repealed. So in the winter session of the parliament, these farm laws will be repealed. So it can be looked from two perspectives. First is a political prism, and second is the economic prism. Political prism is best summed up by the words of Mahatma Gandhi again, which were: first they'll ignore you, then they'll laugh at you, then they'll fight at you, and ultimately you win. This has been, in the broadest sense, when of people's movement. Now, why do I say so? Because earlier they were ignored. They thought that these protests would last for a few days, maximum for a few months. Then they were, when these protesters had their firm resolve, they were discredited as anti-nationals, as Khalistanis, those who would undermine unity, those who are named, those who are politically motivated. But again, all these considerations or all these allegations fell flat because these protests were largely peaceful. So this editorial does not focus on the political aspect, which has been dealt with in detail on all major commentaries. However, it looks at it from the economic prism. So the writers believe that one of the major reasons these laws failed were because the farming sector has not been uniform across India. The center's policy of one law, one nation, especially in terms of the farming sector, proved to be counterproductive because farming in general has been a state subject. Each state has its own way of procuring agricultural produce. Now, if we consider the Punjab model, it has been historically based on MSP, which is the minimum support price, and the APMC mandis. And these mandis have been the strongholds of local middlemen, uh, the balutidars, and the traders. Not that they are all benevolent, but the farmers had found a way to bargain with them, to go around them, and find an optimum rate for their produce, because the MSP and the APMC provided a sort of semblance or a sort of surety to these farmers, and they had become accustomed to it. So the sudden withdrawal would increase the anxieties of farmers, which were accustomed to them, because the government believed in the 1991 reforms. So these three farm laws were compared to the pivotal 1991 reforms of liberalization, privatization, globalization, which unleashed unleashed the animal spirits of the Indian economy, and they proved to be a boom because they decreased license runs and made trading easier. But the same cannot be said about farm sector, because nearly, as mentioned earlier, two-thirds of the population is engaged in it. And the major concern was these farm laws undermined their local interests and fueled anxiety with respect to corporates, because a recurring theme of these protests was the two major conglomerates, Adani and Ambani, because the farmers believed that they would be at the mercy of these large corporates and they would lose their existence. So the writers believe that a state or the government in general is a necessary actor to ensure fair competition and to ensure that disputes are redressed, because this government has a policy of favoring privatization and going out of business, because as our finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman said, it is not the business of the government to be in business. However, economic policy making has to be rooted in the real market practices and real politics. It cannot be on the basis of privatization solely, because exit of the state would leave the farmers at the mercy of private sector in terms of bargaining power, and there were a lack of sufficient checks and balances. So the writers argue that finally exit of the state is not a good strategy, because to ensure a level playing field, it must it is the state which has the broad regulatory and the policy approvals and the necessary investment in infrastructure, risk mitigation, and ensuring agriculture credit loan, because the lack of these things has precisely left off the private sector or the cooperatives or the other enterprises to enter into the fray. Before creating any farm laws or before bringing out any farm laws, it is necessary that a certain benchmark or a certain ideal conditions are created such that these sectors can build upon them and agricultural can be self-sustained and not only on the basis of subsidies and government funds. So this was about the farm laws, and the last topic for today would be Omicron, or Omicron as you would want to say, which is the latest variant of concern identified by the WHO. So this has not been the first variant. We had the alpha variant from UK, the beta from South Africa, and the infamous delta variant, which was B1617.2 from India, and the gamma variant from Brazil. Currently, delta variant is wreaking havoc across Europe and US. It has research there, and as those Western countries were tackling it, news from South Africa came that the scientists, especially working at the Network for Genomic Surveillance, have detected a new variant which has a set of unnatural mutations or unnaturally high number of mutations. And the variant was B11529, right? So rather than naming it as new or Z, uh, considering the geopolitical imperatives, WHO named it as Omicron. Now, why not Z? Because the name Z rings a bell with President of China, which is Xi Jinping, where the first cases of COVID-19 were detected, and to avoid stigma and related to it, the WHO has decided to term it Omicron, right? And for those of you who would be watching uh, the stocks keenly. The market has been facing a bloodbath. Sensex, Nifty both are at their lowest point in nearly 7 months, despite India having crossed the peak of second wave and on its road of recovery. But due to weak investor sentiments, India, the market indices have crashed. So for those willing to invest, it would be a safe bet to invest in pharma companies, especially Dr. Reddy's or Cipla, which are involved in manufacturing of COVID vaccines, Remdesivir, or Pfizer for that matter, or Merck for that matter, which were investigating newer drugs such as Molnupiravir. And investing in durables is not recommended at present. Why is it a variant of concern? Any variant of concern generally fulfills four criteria. Firstly, obviously, it harbors more mutations, more than 30, and these mutations have been in genes which encode for the spike proteins, which is a metric of transmissibility of the virus. So, currently, we do not know the exact trend as to how transmissible it is or how infectious it is, but it has a potential for higher transmissibility, a potential for resistance to the existing vaccines, and a potential for a more severe disease compared to that of Delta virus, owing to its easy attachment to the respiratory mucosa through its spike proteins. So this is what we know. The WHO has said that it is not difficult to detect it by RT-PCR methods because RT-PCR generally employs two or more genes which can be detected. So even if one undergoes mutation, the other two can be easily detected. So detection has not been a problem. But in terms of disease severity and response to vaccines, it is a variant of concern. And only it is in due course of time that we would know about how concerning the virus is. Secondary prevention measures remain our best bet or our best hedge against COVID-19. We need to step up screening and genome sequencing of travelers uh, arriving from South Africa, Botswana, Namibia. The Prime Minister recently chaired a meeting, and these measures have already been put in place for screening and genome sequencing. Uh, there was a time when we faced a shortage of COVID vaccines, and the duration or the time gap was increased from 4 weeks to 6 weeks. Uh, in order so that vaccine hesitancy does not creep in, it would be better to go for a revision of these intervals and to allay any fears with respect to the efficacy of vaccines. And COVID appropriate behavior is a must, especially in terms of masking, social distancing, frequent hand washing, especially when elections and festive season are around the corner. But again, that's better said than done, easier said than done, because as Indians, we have a short collective memory because it has hardly been a few months since the Delta surge of April, May 2021, where India used to report a peak of 4 lakh cases per day and close to 4,000 deaths a day. Uh, so far, we are touching around 10,000 cases a day, and the mortality has reduced around 10 times to 400 per day. But that's still large. And with the discovery of this new variant, the possibility of a new surge cannot be discounted. So it's always better to be vigilant and to err on the side of caution. On a broader policy basis, the government and the private hospitals need to stock up on medical supplies and drugs because an emergency will never come knocking on the door. It will just come through and ravage whatever comes in its path. So, thank you everyone. This is all for today's editorial analysis. In the next one, we'll talk about the pressing issues of our time, climate change, the buzzword which is crypto, and the long-term challenge of China and COD. If you found it helpful, do like it. Do let me know in the comments what you think of it. Or if there are any suggestions, I'll be more than happy. Thank you.